There's an interesting contradiction happening right now. The same generation that was told, go outside and don't come back until the streetlights turn on, is now being criticized for being too involved in their children's lives. And that irony tells you almost everything you need to know about Generation X parents. If you grew up in the late 60s, 70s, or early 80s, chances are you remember walking into an empty house after school. No parents, no supervisión, just you, a key, and a few hours to figure things out on your own. For many Gen X kids, both parents were working, something that became dramatically more common during that era. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, between 1970 and 1990, the number of mothers with young children in the workforce rose sharply. It was a cultural shift happening in real time. And so the Latchkey kid was born. You let yourself in. You made a snack. You did your homework, or didn't. You handled your problems. If you got into trouble at school, you dealt with it. Your parents weren't emailing teachers. They weren't calling other parents to mediate playground conflicts. You learned independence not as a philosophy, but as survival. In fact, a 2004 study by Reach Advisors described Gen X as one of the least parented generations in modern American history. That's not an exaggeration. Emotional self-reliance wasn't optional. It was expected, and that kind of upbringing leaves a mark. On one hand, it builds resilience. You become capable, adaptable. You don't panic easily because you've been solving your own problems since you were 8 years old. But on the other hand, independence can quietly blur into isolation. There's a difference between being strong and feeling unseen. Fast forward to today, and many Gen X parents openly admit something important. Their childhood still shapes how they raise their kids. They don't necessarily resent how they grew up. In fact, many value the freedom they had. But they also remember what it felt like to come home to silence, to wonder if anyone noticed what you were going through. So they've made a conscious choice. They want to be present, not suffocating, not controlling, but present. Some people call them stealth fighter parents. They aren't hovering constantly. They're not micromanaging every interaction. They'll let their kids work through social drama, academic stress, and small failures. But if something truly matters, bullying, injustice, a serious issue, they show up with surprising intensity. It's almost surgical, quiet most of the time, fierce when necessary. What's fascinating is that many Gen X parents didn't set out to be this way. A lot of them swore they wouldn't overcorrect. They appreciated their independence growing up. But something shifts when you become the parent. Memories resurface. The empty house. The feeling of figuring it out alone. The quiet question of whether anyone was really paying attention. And that memory changes you. There's a well-known psychologist, Diana Baumrind, who identified different parenting styles based on two factors: warmth and expectations. Warmth is about emotional availability. Expectations are about structure and boundaries. When parents are high in both, emotionally supportive but clear about rules, it's called authoritative parenting. And research in developmental psychology consistently shows that this style tends to produce confident, emotionally regulated, socially capable kids. Not authoritarian, which is strict but cold. Not permissive, which is loving but boundaryless. Authoritative parenting says, I'm here for you, and you're still responsible for your choices. Now, there's no sweeping data proving Gen X universally adopted this approach. But if you listen to how they talk about parenting, it fits. They want to guide, but not control. They want their kids to struggle, but not alone. And context matters. Gen X entered adulthood during economic uncertainty. They witnessed layoffs, recessions, shrinking pensions, and the disappearance of long-term job security. Stability felt less guaranteed than it had for the generation before them. When you grow up understanding that systems can fail, you don't raise kids expecting the world to protect them. You raise them to be adaptable, resilient, capable. But here's the twist. They're doing all of this in a world completely different from the one they grew up in. Gen X is the first generation raising children in the age of social media. They remember privacy. They remember making mistakes that weren't permanently archived online. They remember boredom, and how boredom forced creativity. Now, they're parenting in a culture where milestones are posted, achievements are compared, and mistakes can go viral. For a generation that grew up relatively unobserved, constant digital visibility feels unnatural. And maybe that's part of why so many Gen X parents seem tired. They're often part of what's called the sandwich generation, caring for aging parents, managing careers that may have plateaued, navigating financial pressure, while also trying to be more emotionally present than their own parents were. They're translating between generations that don't speak the same emotional language. Boomers sometimes think they're too soft. Gen Z sometimes thinks they're too strict. And they're standing in the middle, trying to merge two philosophies: the independence they valued and the emotional presence they missed. What's also interesting is this: Gen X doesn't obsess over external validation. That Latchkey experience taught them something profound. Outside approval is unreliable. So they parent based on internal calibration. What felt good? What hurt? What would I have needed in that moment? That means they might let their teenager repeat a mistake, because they know experience teaches better than lectures. But they'll also answer the phone at 2 a.m. without judgment, because they remember what it felt like to have no one call. Technology is another layer. Gen X lived both lives, before and after the internet. They understand what offline childhood feels like. They remember building forts, riding bikes aimlessly, entertaining themselves without algorithms. So when they set screen limits, it's not panic-based. It's experiential. They know what constant digital stimulation costs. They're fluent in technology, more than their parents ever were, but skeptical in ways their kids aren't. And maybe that's why you'll see a Gen X parent at a school event looking slightly uncomfortable with the hyper-competitive intensity around them, but still fully present. They may not be the loudest voice in the room, but they're there. They're trying to raise children who feel secure without being dependent, who feel supported without being shielded from reality. Is it perfect? No. Does it fit neatly into parenting manuals? Not exactly. But for a generation once described as underparented and undernurtured, choosing to show up emotionally is a radical shift. They're attempting something subtle but powerful. Keep the resilience. Add the warmth. Maintain the independence. Remove the loneliness. And that balancing act is complex. But complexity has always been Gen X's territory. They were never particularly interested in fitting into clean categories anyway. And maybe that's what makes their parenting style so uniquely human. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing for more deep dives into generational psychology. And if you'd like to support the channel and help us continue exploring topics like this, you can join as a member below. Because understanding how we were raised might be the key to understanding how we raise the next generation.